One of the more passionate groups on LinkedIn is the army of HubSpot implementation partners, right? Say something nice about HubSpot, they sing your praises. Say something not so nice or slightly critical, and you're singled out as kind of, heretic number one. So let's see if we can get those people riled up today in one direction or the other as we compare HubSpot and Salesforce over similar periods in the two companies' histories. Welcome to episode 22 of the SaaS Report. I'm your host, Matt Aird, and today is a little bit of a different episode, right? We're going to be taking a look at HubSpot and comparing that to Salesforce's historic performance to understand whether or not HubSpot is on a similar trajectory. So first, let me explain the period of time that we'll be covering. So we're going to be taking a look at Salesforce from 2004 through to 2014 and comparing that to HubSpot's performance from 2014 through to 2024. The reason that I've picked this time period is that at the beginning of that time frame, both companies were roughly at about 100 million in ARR. So Salesforce slightly below that at about 85 million, HubSpot slightly north of that at about 105, right? But near enough as a starting point. Second reason, and this is just for practical purposes, both companies went public in that year. And so what that allows us to do is to start to get more detailed insights into the company's performance. Salesforce went public in 2004, HubSpot went public in 2014. So we'll start to get really good data at the beginning of those periods. The other interesting thing about those two timelines is that they both include a pretty significant kind of macro disruption, right? So we've got the GFC for Salesforce in that period around kind of 08, 09. And then for HubSpot, we've got the kind of post-COVID slowdown period that occurred in 22, 23. I even looked at GDP growth rates during those periods to make sure that kind of the macro influence wasn't, significantly outsized in one period or the other. And average GDP growth during Salesforce's 11-year time span came in at 1.9%, and HubSpot's time span that came in at 2.4%. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's get stuck into this comparison and take a look at our first metric. Now, the obvious place to start, if we wanted to look at whether or not HubSpot was on a similar trajectory to Salesforce, would be to look at ARR growth rates. But we're not going to start there. I want to save that for a little bit later in the episode. So where we're going to start first of all is looking at kind of capital allocation decisions and understanding where these two companies decided to invest their resources in order to generate ARR growth. So the first thing that we're going to look at is R&D spending as a percentage of revenue. Now, what we can see on this chart here is that HubSpot decided to invest significantly more into R&D as a percentage of revenue than Salesforce did throughout the entire time frame. At all points, they were investing about 2 times as much as a percentage of revenue into R&D compared to Salesforce. Now, when we take these percentages and start to look at them in terms of cumulative R&D spend over the 11-year time frame, the disparity starts to become kind of really obvious. So as we can see in this chart here, over the 11 years from 2014 to 2024, HubSpot invested about $2.8 billion into R&D compared to Salesforce's $1.9 billion over their 11-year period, right? So HubSpot invested about 47% more cold hard dollars into R&D than Salesforce did over that time frame. The picture when it comes to sales and marketing spending is a little bit more mixed. We can see on this chart here that HubSpot starts out super aggressive in terms of sales and marketing spending, right? They're spending in the early years about 65% of revenue on S&M, but that steadily kind of tailed off across the course of the 11-year period and went down to a much more reasonable kind of 46% in 2024. Salesforce been much more consistent on this metric. So their range was from 57% at the peak down to 46% of revenue at the bottom end. But overall, this chart doesn't give us too much insight into, who was more aggressive in this category, right? Who invested more money overall in that 11-year period in terms of raw dollar figures. So that picture again becomes much clearer when we look at cumulative spend over the 11 years. And in this case here, we can see that Salesforce significantly outspent HubSpot in terms of sales and marketing investment. The spending was pretty similar kind of across the first 5 years, with HubSpot actually leading up until that point. But Salesforce investment over the end of that period kind of really made them pull away here. So they invested a total of $7.8 billion in sales and marketing compared to HubSpot's $5.5 billion. So that's a 42% difference over that 11-year time frame. So one is obviously much more kind of product focused, right? HubSpot investing much more heavily into product and R&D. Salesforce much more content to kind of spend on sales and marketing as a way to generate ARR growth. So how did this impact ARR growth rates? You're going to have to wait to see that. What we're going to have a look at next is how the spending on sales and marketing and R&D netted out in terms of operating income and free cash flow margins for the two companies. So let's take operating income or loss as the starting point here. And what we can see here is that Salesforce was much more conservative in terms of overall spending than HubSpot was. So they ran kind of positive operating margins for most of the time period that we're analyzing here, and then loosened up on it slightly towards the end. HubSpot, on the other hand, started out very aggressively, right? So running big operating losses, greater than negative 40% in operating margin for the first 2 years. And then this gradually improved over time. During kind of the COVID boom, we saw another re-acceleration in spending here. So this is the kind of 2021 year timeframe. So 2020, 2021, they re-accelerated spending and losses there to accelerate ARR growth. And then over the last couple of years have tapered that back off as SaaS companies across the board have been much more conservative, trying to get to operating income break-evens and higher rates of free cash flow. Now, one of the things that this chart doesn't show is just kind of the expectations on technology companies during the cycles in which these companies were coming up, right? So during the 2010s, in the period that we're looking at for HubSpot here, there was an expectation that companies would burn a ton of cash, run large operating losses in order to capture market share and establish their kind of position within the markets that they were trying to capture. In the time frame that we're analyzing for Salesforce here, we remember this is kind of just post the .com bubble bursting, right? And so there was probably a lot less excitement in terms of investing in software businesses that were burning large sums of money or weren't kind of profitable. And so Salesforce had to contend with that and probably run a tighter ship just based on kind of the expectations of the market at the time. That being said, HubSpot was kind of much less efficient overall. So they ended up with cumulative losses of 800 million over their 11-year time span compared to 120 million in losses for Salesforce. Right now, let's have a look at free cash flow margins. So these follow a pretty similar trend to operating margins. So as you can see here, again, HubSpot starts out much more aggressively with negative rates of free cash flow, and then that moderates over time. Salesforce had kind of a big uptick in free cash flow margins post the GFC, so 08-09 period. So the idea here being that as the kind of world in general became less confident, Salesforce, I think, was wanting to show some fiscal discipline and say, hey, we're able to generate higher rates of free cash flow. We're able to kind of self-sustain the business here. And so we saw that uptick in the middle of this chart. And then as things began to stabilize again, we see those free cash flow margins drop back off as they invest again more aggressively into growing the company, right? And then on the flip side of that, we see an uptick for HubSpot at the end of the period. And again, that's probably a response to the macro environment that we're operating in, right? HubSpot over the last couple of years has been part of this kind of change in the narrative where SaaS companies need to be, again, producing much higher rates of free cash flow because growth is harder to come by. Right, so let's sort of recap what we've learned so far. So the way I would summarize the data to this point is that HubSpot was much more aggressive early on in terms of deploying money to try to grow market share, right? Ran large operating losses, spent very heavily on R&D, spent very aggressively on sales and marketing in the early part of the period, and then saw that taper off in response to kind of the software recession or software slowdown that took place post the COVID boom. And then the divergence there is that we kind of see an inversion of that trend for Salesforce, right? They started off kind of much more cautious, then began to accelerate spending and decreasing free cash flow margins at the end of the period as they look to kind of accelerate growth rates for the business. Right, now let's get into the good stuff. So how did these decisions around capital allocation impact growth rates for these two companies? So as I mentioned at the beginning, Salesforce starts off this 11-year time frame at an ARR run rate of about 85 million. HubSpot starts this at about 105 million as their starting point. As we can see on this chart here, Salesforce starts out much hotter than HubSpot in terms of ARR growth rate. So they're growing north of 80% for the first 3 years. HubSpot, on the other hand, is hovering somewhere between 50 and 60% during that time frame. Then that tails off for both organizations, culminating in a large dip in 2010 for Salesforce. Now again, this is probably in response to macro conditions, probably in response to what was happening in terms of the GFC. And then they recover those growth rates and it stabilizes at around about 30%. HubSpot, on the other hand, sees this big uptick during the kind of COVID growth boom era, returning to 50% ARR growth rates. And then, like most SaaS orgs over the last couple of years, have seen those growth rates trend downwards pretty aggressively over the last few years. Now, when we map these ARR growth rates onto a net new ARR chart, we can start to see some pretty big disparities year to year. Now, as we can see here in this analysis, there's only 1 year across these 11-year timeframes in which HubSpot adds more net new ARR than Salesforce does. And that's in the peak COVID boom era of 2021. So they added about 400 million in net new ARR versus 341 million for Salesforce in that overlapping period. So aside from that, it's a clean sweep for Salesforce, right? And that culminates in this massive delta in the final year where Salesforce adds almost $1 billion in net new ARR in that final year of analysis. Now, when we turn that kind of net new ARR chart into an ARR run rate chart over time, we can see that the gap just kind of continues to widen year after year for Salesforce, right? So Salesforce ends this 11-year comparison period at 3.8 billion in ARR. HubSpot sits at 2.6 billion over the 11-year period. That gives Salesforce compound annual growth rate of 41%, and HubSpot gets a CAGR of 34% over those 11 years. There is one potential wrinkle here though, and that is if we think back a couple of slides, Salesforce outspent HubSpot pretty significantly on sales and marketing. So it is possible, right, that they just bought this ARR growth, right? And they could have done that through much less efficient kind of go-to-market metrics. So let's take a look at CAC Payback and compare them to get a better understanding of this. So when we look at this chart, we can see that Salesforce outperforms HubSpot in terms of CAC Payback, except for the periods of 2020 and 21 for HubSpot, right? Which were some of the best years in terms of kind of CAC Payback for companies overall. So during the 11-year time span, Salesforce averaged CAC Payback of 18 months, HubSpot averaged CAC Payback of 23 months. Magic number for these orgs, again, looks pretty similar. As a reminder, magic number is just net new ARR divided by the spend on sales and marketing. So basically what it tells us is, how much net new ARR a company generates for every dollar spent on sales and marketing. And again, HubSpot was more efficient in that 2020 and 2021 range. But aside from those 2 years, it's a clean sweep for Salesforce. So overall, Salesforce had an average magic number of 0.87. HubSpot came in at 0.65. So in conclusion, right, there isn't any doubt that Salesforce was the better performing company during these periods, right? They grew faster, they did it more efficiently in terms of go-to-market metrics, and they did it by burning kind of less cash. One thing though that this report doesn't take into account is kind of the broader state of SaaS during the two comparative periods, right? So in 2004, when Salesforce starts off their journey in the analysis that we just did, there's probably, according to Perplexity, about 1,500 SaaS companies in total across the world, right? Fast forward to 2014, and that number has probably increased at least 10x, right? And so the ability for a company to be able to cut through the noise, attract customers, win new business is certainly going to be much harder in the environment that HubSpot's operating in than the environment that Salesforce was operating in 2004, right? That being said, the path for a kind of traditional enterprise B2B SaaS co to catch up and overtake Salesforce at this point won't be an easy one, right? Salesforce is now at 40 billion in ARR. They're still 15 times larger than HubSpot, and they've gone through, this period of amazing growth in the early kind of 2000s and 2010s that's allowed them to establish just a significant lead on most of the competitors in the market space, right? If you like that breakdown, jump over, I'll put a link here, jump over and subscribe to the newsletter. There's a couple of additional charts that I haven't shared in this video here that you can take a look at. It'll break down things like value creation. So what was the impact of this performance on share price and market cap during that time? I've also got a chart in there that breaks down kind of gross margin performance across the 11-year periods, and then ARR per employee as well. So if you want to take a look at those numbers, go and subscribe to the newsletter and you'll get the full report breakdown sent to your inbox. Hope you enjoyed that episode today. If you like that comparison, there's a couple of others that I could do that I could think of. We could probably look at some companies in the work management space, in the cybersecurity space as well. So if you want me to do some breakdowns, let me know which companies you want me to compare, and I'll jump in, pull out the metrics, and give you the rundown on them. So thanks for tuning in today. That's it for this week. I'll see you again next week. Until then, goodbye.